to introduce this evening's event. I'm Joanne Greenaway. I am the Chief Exec of LSJS, and we wish we could host you on our campus, but in the place of that, I'm delighted that you're all here with us to commemorate, of course, Kristallnacht. I should say that this evening's event is a partnership between us at LSJS, along with March of the Living UK and the St Martin Gilbert Learning Centre. It's the second partnership event that we've run, and it's really wonderful to be able to work so closely together. And I really thank Cassie and Scott from March of the Living, and Vicky and Shirley from St Martin Gilbert Learning Centre, as well as Lady Esther Gilbert, late St Martin's wife, who I believe is here. I really thank you for the opportunity to work together, and please God, it will be the start of many initiatives in the future. For those of you who don't know LSJS, I know Cassie will have an opportunity to talk a little bit later about March of the Living, but for those of you who don't know us, we are a Centre of Excellence in Jewish Education. We have a campus in Hendon, and we run many different education programs, as well as running teacher training and degrees programs. So we're really about training and developing educators and teachers for our community and its schools. And we work very closely with a number of different organisations. So we have 14 organisations on our campus, all within the Jewish education space, and they include March of the Living, with whom we're working tonight. So that's a bit about us, and I hope those of you who don't know us will get to know you, and I get to meet you in person. This evening we have a really exciting programme planned. We have, as you know, Professor Shirli Gilbert, who's going to be speaking in just a moment to start off this evening. She is the Professor of Modern Jewish History at UCL. She's also the Director of the St Martin Gilbert Learning Centre. And she has done a huge amount of writing and research, particularly focused on the role of music in the ghettos, also relating to responses to how the Holocaust shaped understandings of apartheid in South Africa. She's really fascinating and brilliant, and I'm looking forward to hearing her again. We then afterwards have Eve Kugler. I'm not going to introduce her properly because I know Shirley will come onto that, but I just really wanted to say how absolutely honoured and privileged we are to hear from Eve this evening as a survivor, and really to say also that very sadly Eve's sister, Leah Blayman, passed away just a few days ago in New York, I believe, and it's really unbelievable that Eve was determined to go ahead this evening and speak to us, and I think this is just testament to her dedication really to sharing her story with us. So we wish her long life, and we're really deeply grateful to her for being with us. And this evening is absolutely dedicated to learning in her memory. So thank you both for being with us and for talking to us this evening. Shirley.
Thank you so much, Jo, for the really kind introduction and a very warm welcome. It's nice to see so many of you here. Thank you to Cassie and March of the Living, and also to Jo and the London School of Jewish Studies for partnering with us on this joint event, and especially also to Eve. I feel very honoured to share the virtual stage with you, and as Jo said, I'll give you a proper introduction later. The way we'll do this is I will give an overview of the history, and then afterwards I will interview Eve, and we'll talk a little bit about the German Jewish experience of Kristallnacht. So I'm here, as Jo said, representing the St Martin Gilbert Learning Centre, which was established a few years ago in memory of the late British historian Sir Martin. And as Jo said too, his widow, Lady Esther, is here with us today, which is also a great honour. Our aim at the centre is really to bring the best historical research to non-academic audiences, which was something that Martin was just brilliant at, to make history accessible and exciting. And we offer quite a wide range of programs across the year, so please do check out our website and join our mailing list. And Sarah will send out a link to our website in the chat just now. So we are commemorating tonight an event that many see as a key turning point in the history of the Holocaust. And I would imagine that some of you are familiar with many aspects of that history. So today I'm going to start by zooming in on perhaps the most central historical document that chronicles, though from a very particular perspective, what happened that night. And through that document, we will slowly zoom out and hopefully gain some new perspective on how events unfolded and why. And that document is a telegram that was issued early on the morning of the 10th of November 1938 by Reinhard Heydrich, who you see pictured here. Heydrich was born on the 7th of March 1904, close to Leipzig. And he was the son of a well-known music educator and an opera singer who lived in the region. And in fact, he himself became quite a gifted cellist as a child. But during World War I, the young Reinhard became attracted to the racist, folkish nationalism that was becoming popular. And by the time he finished high school in the spring of 1922, instead of fulfilling his father's hopes that he make a career in music, he decided to enlist in the German Navy. This was less than a month after his 18th birthday. Heydrich was introduced to Heinrich Himmler, the chief of the SS, in Munich by a family friend. And you see in this photo in front of you, Heinrich Himmler seated in the center with Heydrich standing on our left to Himmler's right. Himmler was so impressed with Heydrich that he brought him into the SS in August of 1931, when Heydrich was barely 27 years old. The SS, or Schutzstaffel, Protection Squadron, was the most influential group within the Nazi Party, made up of the so-called racial elite, and eventually, many years later, responsible for solving the so-called Jewish question in Europe. Now, Heydrich became responsible for developing the security service, the Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, within the SS. And by January of 1933, when Hitler came to power, the SD had become the most significant intelligence agency in the Nazi Party. In the summer of 1934, Heydrich also took command of the Gestapo, the secret police, and in 1936, he became chief of the newly established Security Police Main Office, which brought together the Gestapo and the criminal police detective forces. As part of its work, Heydrich's SD established intelligence departments to study the alleged machinations of the Reich's enemies, chief among them, of course, Jews, as the Nazis defined them, rather than as they might have defined themselves, and also those who thought like Jews, communists, liberals, social democrats, those who advocated for minority rights, Christian clergy who opposed the regime, and many others. The Gestapo arrested these opponents, and where they deemed it appropriate, they imprisoned them in concentration camps under the pretext of what they called protective custody, or Schutzhaft. So in this telegram, which is what we're going to be reading a little more closely, Heydrich instructed local German officers on how to carry out the anti-Jewish measures that became known as Kristallnacht. So if you'll bear with me, this is a bit wordy, but we'll read the telegram and then we'll look at it in a little bit more detail. So this is a copy of the telegram from Munich of November 10th, 1938, very early in the morning, 1:20 a.m., about measures against the Jews tonight. Following the attempt on the life of the Secretary of the Legation von Rath in Paris, writes Heydrich, demonstrations against the Jews are to be expected in all parts of the Reich in the course of the coming night. The instructions below are to be applied in dealing with these events. First, the chiefs of the state police or their deputies must immediately, upon receipt of this telegram, contact the political leaders in their areas to discuss the arrangements for the demonstrations. Only such measures are to be taken as do not endanger German lives or property. In other words, synagogues are to be burned down only where there is no danger of fire in neighboring buildings. Foreign citizens, even if they are Jews, are not to be molested. On the assumption that the guidelines detailed under paragraph 1 are observed, the demonstrations are not to be prevented by the police, which is only to supervise the observance of the guidelines. And finally, as you can see, I've just excerpted bits from the telegram. As soon as the course of events during the night permits the release of the officials required, as many Jews in all districts, especially the rich, as can be accommodated in existing prisons, are to be arrested. For the time being, only healthy male Jews who are not too old are to be detained. Special care, it says in the last sentence, is to be taken that the Jews arrested in accordance with these instructions are not ill-treated. So let's look at those in a little bit more detail, those bits of Heydrich's telegram. The first thing he mentions is the attempt on the life of the Secretary of the Legation vom Rat in Paris. What does he mean here? Well, on the 29th of October, less than 2 weeks before this telegram was written, the Nazis had expelled from Germany about 17,000 Polish Jews, or rather Jews with Polish passports. Many of them had been living in Germany for at least a generation. And actually, Eve's grandfather was one of these. These Jews were transported to the Polish border in the cold and rain, driven by armed guards with dogs. And when they got to the border, they were refused entry. In the border town of Zbazin, a transit camp was hastily put together in deserted barracks and stables for these stranded deportees. And among them was the Greenspan family. They wrote a postcard to their 17-year-old son Herschel in Paris, in which they described the horrors that they were experiencing. They were sleeping in stables, there was horse dung all around them, there wasn't enough bread to go around. The young Herschel was enraged and walked into the German embassy in Paris, where he was living, on the morning of November 7th, and shot the embassy official there named Ernst vom Rat. Vom Rat died 2 days later, on the 9th of November, a date that unhappily coincided with the anniversary of Hitler's failed 1923 beer hall putsch. The Nazi leadership was assembled in Munich for a commemoration of the putsch and used vom Rat's death as a pretext for what became known subsequently as Kristallnacht, literally the night of crystal or night of broken glass, although those terms hardly capture the unprecedented anti-Semitic violence that followed. And indeed, that's why most historians prefer nowadays to use the term November pogroms rather than Kristallnacht. In the telegram, Heydrich goes on to explain that demonstrations against Jews are to be expected in all parts of the Reich, and expected is my emphasis. Later, the Nazi leadership would claim that the rioting was a spontaneous uprising driven by the masses who were fed up with the Jews and their criminal actions. But this telegram tells us a different story. By issuing these instructions, albeit in muted language, Heydrich and the Nazi leadership were sanctioning violence against Jews. More than this, they were informing members of the German police across Germany and Austria, which had been annexed to Germany after the Anschluss a few months before. They're announcing that the Jews are fair game. So Heydrich goes on to detail the instructions that are to be applied in dealing with these events. First, he says, the chiefs of state police will inform local leaders that these instructions are coming from the highest level. The Reichsführer SS is Himmler. That is where these instructions are coming from. Only such measures are to be taken as do not endanger German lives or property. In other words, synagogues are to burn down only where there is no danger. So essentially he's saying, well, it's okay to destroy German property as long as neighboring buildings are safe. The German population is not to be inconvenienced, and actually their opinion is quite important. Places of business and apartments belonging to Jews may be destroyed, but not looted. Why? The Nazis undoubtedly wanted to terrorize the Jewish community on this night. But they also had an interest in Jewish wealth. They wanted to ensure that confiscated Jewish property went into party coffers rather than into the hands of individual looters. Also, looting gave an impression of lawlessness, and this was considered distasteful by many Germans. Heydrich goes on to say, foreign citizens, even if they are Jews, are not to be molested. What is this about? Well, sometimes it's important to remind listeners that Hitler actually was sensitive to international criticism. Throughout the pre-war period and also during the early war years, Hitler carefully calculated his actions in order to avoid serious international reactions to the treatment of Jews, among other things. So that night, Nazi Brownshirts and Hitler Youth units throughout Germany and Austria went on the rampage. Many of them wore civilian clothes, supporting the pretense that this was just a spontaneous outburst of public anger. They destroyed 267 synagogues, often in full view of the public and of local firefighters. They shattered the windows of about 7,500 Jewish-owned shops and businesses and looted their wares, and Jewish cemeteries became a particular target of vandalism. The pogroms were especially destructive in Berlin and Vienna, which were home to the two largest Jewish communities in the Reich. Mobs would roam the streets and attack Jews in their homes, often forcing Jews that they encountered to perform public acts of humiliation. Although murder was not mentioned in Heydrich's instructions, at least 91 Jews were killed that night, and many women were raped. The final clause of Heydrich's telegram instructs that rich, healthy male Jews will be taken to concentration camps. That night, 30,000 men were arrested and taken first to prisons, as his instructions stated, and then to concentration camps, most of them to Dachau, Sachsenhausen, and Buchenwald. Dachau near Munich, Sachsenhausen near Berlin, and Buchenwald near Weimar. And here you see a photograph of male Jews being arrested during Kristallnacht. This was the first time that the Nazi regime had imprisoned Jews on a large scale simply as Jews. So until now, those who had been imprisoned in Nazi camps were primarily the Nazis' political opponents, especially those on the left, communists and social democrats, as well as so-called asocials. This was a catch-all category that included criminals, prostitutes, Roma and Sinti, homosexuals, and others. So what was the purpose of imprisoning tens of thousands of Jews now? The purpose was not, at this point, primarily to kill them, although hundreds did die as a result of the brutal treatment that they received. The purpose was to push them to immigrate. This had actually been the primary goal of Nazi policy for some time. And men who were arrested on this night were now told that they would be released on the condition that they would begin the process of immigration. By imprisoning men, and especially wealthy ones, the Nazis hoped that they would expedite this process of immigration, of pushing the Jews to immigrate. And indeed, Kristallnacht would be the final straw that moved many Jews to leave Germany in the following months. All over Germany, local residents watched the pogrom unfold before their eyes. And we have a lot of images of that night, but I find this image particularly moving from the vantage point of those who are watching, so many of them. Some attempted to help, but many remained silent. Shortly after the pogroms, a Protestant clergyman from Berlin explained in a letter to the Nazi leadership what he found objectionable about what had happened. This is what he writes. Dear sirs, the events that occurred among our people on and after November 9th of this year, 1938, forced me to take a clear stand. Far be it from me, I've emphasized the bits that I find particularly interesting and striking in this letter. Far be it from me, he says, to disregard the sins that many members of the Jewish people have committed against our fatherland, especially during the last decades. Also, far be it from me to deny the right of orderly and moderate proceedings against the Jewish race. But not only will I by no means justify the numerous excesses against Jewry that took place on and after November 9th of this year, but I reject them deeply ashamed, as they are a blot on the good name of the Germans. In other words, this man objected not so much to the targeting of the Jews, who indeed, as he says, have committed many sins, but rather he objected to the excesses. He would have been fine, it seems, with what he calls orderly and moderate proceedings. And in this, he reflected the views of many ordinary Germans. There was a low level of disapproval. People didn't like the disorder, the violence, the public disruption, but there was no general outcry, no formal responses from the churches, from universities. In other words, the objection or the disapproval seems to have been not so much about support for the Jews. Anti-Semitism indeed was still rife. Now, in the years leading up to 1938, there was an ongoing debate within the Nazi Party about how to tackle the so-called Jewish question. Some members of the party took a more radical approach. They advocated violence against Jews, forcing people to boycott Jewish businesses and things like that. Others took a more moderate approach, arguing that a legal method was more appealing to the public and also looked better to the international community, would be better for the economy, better for foreign investment. Hitler's view on this was clear from quite early on. This is the earliest extant piece of writing that we have from Hitler. This is a letter on the Jewish question, which was published on the 16th of September, 1919, in which Hitler writes, "Anti-Semitism as a political movement should not and cannot be determined by emotional factors, but rather by a realization of the facts. First, Jewry is clearly a racial and not a religious group. Everything that is for other people a source of higher life is for the Jew merely a means to an end, namely the satisfaction of his lust for power and money. His actions, says Hitler, will result in a racial tuberculosis of peoples," and note the language of disease. "Hence it follows," and this is the important bit, "anti-Semitism based on purely emotional grounds will find its ultimate expression in the form of pogroms, which are capricious and thus not truly effective. Rational anti-Semitism, however, must pursue a systematic legal campaign against the Jews by the revocation of the special privileges they enjoy in contrast to the other foreigners living among us. But the final objective must be the complete removal of the Jews." From the moment that he took power in January 1933, Hitler pursued a systematic legal campaign against the Jews. During the first 6 years of his regime before the outbreak of war, the government passed more than 400 laws and decrees that increasingly, gradually restricted the rights of Jews. One of the first major laws was what was called the Law for the Restoration of the Professional Civil Service. This was passed on the 7th of April 1933, and this dismissed Jews and those deemed politically unreliable from the civil service. And in the weeks and months that followed in 1933, a number of laws were passed restricting all sorts of things, including Jewish students at German schools and universities, limiting Jewish activity in the medical and legal professions, revoking the licenses of Jewish tax consultants and other professionals, imposing quotas, and many more things. Local governments also issued laws that affected other aspects of Jewish life. So, for example, prohibiting kosher slaughter. Probably the most important set of laws were the Nuremberg laws, so called because they were announced at the annual party rally in Nuremberg in September 1935. And these laws really institutionalized racial ideology. The laws revoked Jews' citizenship in Germany and outlawed relationships between Jews and people of, quote, German or related blood. The Nuremberg laws didn't define Jews as a religion, but rather, as you can see in this chart, by ancestral lineage. Jews are the ones on the far right of the chart. A Jew was anyone with 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents, and Jews, of course, fittingly for this context, are indicated by a full black circle. Jews are defined as Jews if they have 3 or 4 grandparents, regardless of whether or not they identify as Jewish or observe Jewish law. And here is what Hitler said in a speech before the Reichstag on the 15th of September 1935 about the Nuremberg laws. And he's talking at the beginning of this excerpt about attempts to sabotage German interests in the international arena. And he says this is because of the action of Jewish elements who are trying to incite the international community against the Germans. Lest these occurrences lead to the outbreak of vigorous defensive actions on the part of the Aryan population, says Hitler, we have no choice but to contain the problem through legislative measures. Again, I've emphasized. The government of the German Reich is guided by the idea that it may nonetheless be possible, through the agency of a definitively secular solution, to create a basis upon which the German people can have a tolerable relation with the Jews. This law is an attempt to find a legislative solution to the Jewish problem. And more ominously, in the event that this attempt fails, it will be necessary to transfer the problem by law to the National Socialist Party for a final solution. Now, in these pre-war years, it's important to emphasize that the Nazis' main goal was the removal of Jews from German economic and social life, and the primary solution was considered emigration. Now, granted, the Nazis made it increasingly difficult for the Jews to actually leave. They imposed heavy taxes, they imposed limits on what Jews could take with them. But the push was not towards physical violence so much as towards exclusion. In fact, before Kristallnacht, Jews did not endure a lot of physical violence in Germany, although they were certainly subject to what the historian Marion Kaplan has called social death, long before their physical bodies were in danger. They were shunned by their neighbors, by their friends, ignored by shopkeepers, subject to verbal assaults, ostracized, demeaned in most of the places they went. But this is not because anti-Semitism was any better than it was in the Russian Empire, where it was manifest more often as physical violence. As we saw in Hitler's 1919 letter, Nazi anti-Semitism embraced many well-worn themes of anti-Semitism: the idea that Jews were obsessed with power and money, the idea that they would do anything to achieve those aims of power and money. They had no regard for morality or higher principles, and the idea that they were not a religion, but a race, in fact, a disease. But the project Hitler was promoting was not like the Russian pogroms. In his view, as we read, emotional anti-Semitism, as he called it, was bad because it was not effective. His anti-Semitism was rational, and because of that was much more palatable to the public, much more reasonable and seemingly justified, and actually thus much more dangerous than what had come before. After the November pogroms, the government passed dozens of laws which were intended once and for all to eliminate Jews from German life. A fine of 1 billion Reichsmarks was imposed on the German Jewish community. And here we have Goering explaining this on the 12th of November 1938, just a couple of days after the pogroms. The hostile attitude of Jewry toward the German nation and Reich, an attitude which does not even shrink from cowardly murder, demands determined resistance and severe punishment. I therefore order the payment of an atonement of 1 billion Reichsmarks to the German Reich is imposed on all Jewish subjects of the state. Now, Jews had their insurance confiscated. Jewish owners were made responsible for the cost of any repairs ensuing from the night of the pogroms. They were also now completely excluded from the general welfare system. There followed a second phase of an accelerated Aryanization, as it was called, of Jewish-owned enterprises. In other words, Jewish-owned enterprises being taken over by or bought at a very tiny sum by so-called Aryans. Jewish schools were closed. Any Jews who were still attending German schools were expelled. Jews were subject to new taxation. They were required to sell their valuables and many other laws. And the aim of these laws was to completely isolate Jews from the rest of the population, abolish any possibility of Jewish organization, and as I said before, to accelerate immigration. At this point, that was still the main aim. Now, there has been a lot of discussion among historians about when the Nazis took the decision to kill all the Jews. It's widely accepted by historians that this did not happen before 1941, when Operation Barbarossa was launched against the Soviet Union, and mass shootings began on the Eastern Front in the summer and autumn of 1941. But it is also widely accepted by historians that Kristallnacht, the November pogroms, were a turning point because they signaled for the first time a shift towards genocide. Now, one reason why was this such an important turning point? One key reason given for this was the responses of the outside world to what happened. The pogroms received front page coverage in the American and the British press and elsewhere. And in fact, articles about the events continued to appear for several weeks. Actually, no other story about the persecution of the Jews received such widespread coverage at any time during the Nazi era. The German censors tried to stop images from reaching newspapers, but some magazines and newspapers were able to publish some images, as we see here. And the Los Angeles Examiner on the 23rd of November had this striking headline: Nazis warn world Jews will be wiped out unless evacuated by democracies. And at a press conference on the 15th of November, barely a week after Kristallnacht, President Franklin D. Roosevelt denounced the pogroms, saying, "I myself could scarcely believe that such things could occur in a 20th century civilization." He also announced that he had recalled the US ambassador to Germany, Hugh Wilson, who he actually didn't replace until he wasn't replaced until 1945. There were huge protests about the pogroms, especially in New York and Los Angeles, and many called on the American government to increase the number of immigrants that would be allowed to enter the country. But Roosevelt, despite his sympathy, was unwilling to contemplate changing immigration restrictions. The Immigration Act, known as the Johnson-Reed Act or the National Origins Act, had been in place since 1924, and it was intended to severely limit immigration, especially from Southern and Eastern Europe. And it reflects, among other things, a growing anti-Semitic sentiment in the United States. Throughout the 1930s, against the backdrop of the Great Depression, most Americans opposed changing immigration quotas. They feared that immigrants would threaten their jobs and threaten public services. The Jewish refugee problem started becoming a major international issue after the Anschluss, after the annexation of Austria in the spring of 1938. In the attempt to find a solution, President Roosevelt had invited representatives of 32 countries to the French resort town of Evian in July 1938. But in the invitation clearly stated, no country would be expected to receive a greater number of immigrants than is permitted by its existing legislation. In other words, the conference is convened to help immigrants, but those who arrived made no commitment to do anything. The conference at Evian and the fate of the Jews was widely reported in the world press. Some of the reports were hostile, many of them were sympathetic, but no hope was offered to the refugees at Evian. And in short, no country would substantially change their immigration policy, including the US. The Nazi response to this was to laugh at the world and to realize, to recognize that the world cared little, as they saw it, for German Jews. After Kristallnacht, Roosevelt was persuaded to allow about 12,000 Germans, most of them Jews and already in the US on visitor visas, to remain indefinitely. He said, "I cannot in any decent humanity throw them out." But actually the quota system remained unchanged throughout the war and into the late 1940s. Neither the US nor any other country significantly changed their policies or immigration quotas, didn't place economic sanctions or anything. So why did this response facilitate a shift towards genocide? The passivity of the world's response was a powerful signal to Hitler. In a speech to the Reichstag on the 30th of January 1939, Hitler sarcastically reminded his parliament of the world's apathy. And rather than put the words up on the screen for you, I will leave you with this image of Hitler, and I will read you just some excerpts from this by now quite infamous speech that he gave just 8 months or so before the outbreak of the Second World War, and just a couple of months after the November pogroms. "It is a shameful spectacle," he says, "to see how the whole democratic world is oozing sympathy for the poor, tormented Jewish people, but remains hard-hearted and obdurate when it comes to helping them, which is surely, in view of its attitude, an obvious duty. How thankful they must be that we are releasing these precious apostles of culture and placing them at the disposal of the rest of the world." The world has sufficient space for settlements, but we must once and for all get rid of the opinion that the Jewish race was only created by God for the purpose of being, in a certain percentage, a parasite living on the body and the productive work of other nations. This is part of the disease metaphor, the notion that Jews are parasites. Continuing Hitler's quote, the Jewish race will have to adapt itself to sound constructive activity as other nations do, or sooner or later it will succumb to a crisis of an inconceivable magnitude. And now the bit that is probably the most quoted of all of Hitler's speeches. He says, today I will once more be a prophet. If the international Jewish financiers in and outside Europe should succeed in plunging the nations once more into a world war, then the result will not be the Bolshevization of the earth, and thus the victory of Jewry, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. So the world's passive response convinced Hitler that he could push forward, and the passivity with which most German civilians responded to violence also signaled to Hitler that the public at home was prepared for more radical measures. And in the years that followed, as we know, the Nazis' increasingly radical measures resulted in the murder of close to 6 million Jews across Europe. Although, significantly, that violence was kept as far away from Germany as possible in the territories, the occupied territories of Poland and the Soviet Union, so that German civilians for several decades afterwards could argue that we didn't know. And in fact, Kristallnacht was the last time that violence against Jews on such a scale took place within Germany itself. So I've focused the first part of our program on what happened and specifically what was done to Jews. And we'll now move on to hear more about how German Jews themselves experienced these events. And as I said before, I'm really honored to be able to share the virtual stage, as it were, to do this with Eve Kugler, who was born in 1931 in Halle, which is in East Central Germany. At the time, it was a city of about 200,000 people, with only around 2,000 Jews. Her paternal grandfather had come to Halle from Poland in the 1890s. So as I said earlier, he was one of those Polish Jews targeted by that legislation at the end of October 1938. Her grandfather founded a synagogue, which they attended, and where Eve also went to Hebrew school. And her father owned a small department store in Halle that occupied the ground floor of the apartment building in which they lived. Eve was 7, almost 8 years old on the eve of Kristallnacht. Eve, thank you so much for being with us. And let me also just mention your sister and the fact that she would have been 84 years old today. And as Joe said, we were so moved that you took the decision to nonetheless go ahead with this evening, that you felt it's so important to tell your story. So we're very, very grateful for that. Can we start off by hearing a little bit about your experiences that night? Can you tell us a little bit about what happened?
Well, the facts are very simple. That 5 Nazis and the local police chief, who was known to us, burst into our apartment and created havoc. The violence of that night was such that I was really unable to take it and accept it. And the only thing that I was able to do to live with it was really to forget the whole thing. Because to remember what happened was something that was impossible. And it was only as an adult that I finally went to my mother and said, you have to tell me what happened. I don't want to live with a part of my life just missing. I think it's important to bring this out. And there were the fact that young children throughout the Holocaust had this same reaction where they just remembered nothing was actually very common. It was certainly something that Leah did later on in the war when she was hidden and just didn't want to know about it and never remembered any of it. What actually did happen in more detail is they barged in and they went into every room and created destruction. They emptied cupboards and threw linens on the floor. They turned over furniture. They broke dishes. They went into the bedroom and two of the Nazis watched my father get dressed while the others were ramping all over the place. The worst of the destruction occurred in my grandfather's room. He was a learned and very observant Jew. As you heard, he founded the synagogue. And what the Nazis did is to destroy everything that was sacred to the Jewish people. They tore his tallis apart. They took his Gemara and his other Jewish books. They tore the pages out of the spines. And they stamped on them, trampled them. Grandfather had a small Sefer Torah, which was part of his study. Again, they tore that to pieces, stamped on it. And to me, although I didn't physically see it, I heard, and because I loved my grandfather and knew him and knew what all of this, like this was just really the worst thing that I could think that could have happened on that night. Now, personally, my sister Ruth, who was a little more than a year older than I was, were actually awakened by all of the tumult and the noise. And so we were standing in the doorway of our bedroom. And I think, as my mother said, and as Ruth said, just looking in shock, total shock, until the local police chief noticed us. He pushed us back into our room and he slammed the door. And he turned to my mother and he said, "The girls don't need to see this." And eventually, the Nazis marched my father out of our apartment. I didn't see it, but I can visualize it. I can just see him knowing wearing his coat and his hat. Men always wear hats in those days. My father was of medium height, and the Nazis were probably much taller. And it's just an awful, awful memory. And that was it, really. Noise, ruin, destruction, and desecration, all in a matter of not much more than maybe an hour and a half.
And what happened after the pogrom? What happened to your father? What happened to you and your mom and your sisters?
Well, the pogrom wasn't really over for us. What happened next is, in the morning, our shop assistant rang the doorbell. She was in tears, my mother said, and just said, "Please, you have to come down, you have to come down." And my mother threw on some clothes, went downstairs, and as you mentioned before, this small department store that we had occupied the ground floor of the building. It was a large apartment building. During the night, the store windows were broken and glass littered the pavement, the sidewalk. Also, the merchandise in those days was displayed in under the counters were glass. Those too were smashed. Merchandise was all over the shop. And there were Nazis standing there when my mother came down and started screaming about how filthy, untidy the Jewish people were, and clean up this mess and do it now. And my mother then spent the next 2 hours sweeping the sidewalk, and as they were staring at her, probably occasionally pointing, and she was only allowed to go upstairs when there was not a sliver of glass left on the ground. She went upstairs. She was exhausted when my Aunt Fanny came. She was one of my father's sisters who lived in Halle. And the news that she brought was that the synagogue, which grandfather had established all those years before, had been torched, and it burned to the ground as the fire brigade watched until there was nothing left. And then a little while later, other Jewish people, women started to come because my grandfather, having been sort of a de facto leader of the Jewish community, they came to our home and told about all the other Jewish men, all their loved ones, fathers and so forth had been arrested. No one knew what to do. So my mother went across the road to the local police station and said, please kindly tell me where's my husband. And as you had recounted, the answer that she got was, get him a visa so that he can leave. With a visa, he will be freed from Buchenwald and he will get out of Germany. We don't want Jews in Germany. And that, as far as what I consider is the end of the pogrom, all of the events that happened afterwards. The violence was during the night, but the events of the following day obviously are very, very relevant. My father came home. And I must say, it took my mother 4 weeks to get the visa, because visas were impossible to get anymore. No country really, almost no country was offering them. And she spent the whole time looking for someone who would forge a visa. So it was 4 months that my father was in Buchenwald. He came home, and within 2 or 3 days, he went to France. We had relatives in Paris, and that's why if you're going to forge a visa, this is where my mother chose. And very soon thereafter, I don't know the exact time period, we were evicted from our apartment, because all over Germany, and certainly in our city, the Nazis posted a list of a few German homes and said that if your name is not on the list, you were required to leave your home and move in with someone who was on the list. When you think about this, you have to realize that the police and the Nazis knew where every Jew lived. They knew about his family. They knew everything about you, which, as I thought later on as an adult, when I thought about it, I always found very frightening. Fortunately for us, my mother's father, who lived in the city of Leipzig, was on that list. And my mother then took my sisters and me, Leah and Ruth and I, to live with my grandfather. Now, he had already taken in 10 or 12 other Jews who had been made homeless. So the two things to point out is that the conditions were very crowded. And also that I was then separated from my mother. And this is something that I found hugely difficult. My grandfather was gone, and my father was no longer part of us. And then my mother was also not with us. And even though I was very close to both my grandfathers, it's the fact that the people who, my family was no longer with me. It took my mother 6 months to get another visa for us to leave. So from about January until June, we lived in Leipzig. There was actually a Jewish school which was established by teachers who were no longer permitted to teach wherever they had been, and it was supposedly, I'm told, quite a good education. I would also like to mention that part of the time that we were with my grandfather included Pesach, Passover, and before Pesach, my grandfather made a schedule because there were half a dozen families who were sharing his home, and so it was a schedule who was going to use the kitchen when, in order to keep order. But when it came to Pesach, the women decided to pool their food, their efforts, and cook together. And I have some memory of getting my grandmother's Pesach dishes and setting the table, and my grandfather led a Seder for 12 or 15 people who had not really known each other previously. And you will recall perhaps the last words of the Haggadah are next year in Yerushalayim, and you can imagine that the fervor which those words were issued were totally memorable and not to be reduced. And so that was it. We left for Paris in 1939. And I need only to say one more important thing. Again, as you mentioned, which had to do with money. The Nazis made my mother sign papers in which they made the point, legally turned over all of our assets. That included bank accounts, some investments that my father had, insurance policies, a whole variety. A little bit before that, actually, the Nazis produced a man who said, we have found someone who wants to buy your store. The price that was offered was perhaps 1/10 of the value of the business. Immaterial because my mother never saw the money, of course. So we were able to leave Germany finally with 40 marks, 10 marks for each of us, my mother, my sisters, and me. And the family was reunited in Paris, out of Germany, thank God, but of course, penniless.
Thank you, Eve. Can you maybe say a little more about what happened in France? You spent time in Paris, and listeners will be able to gather from your accent that you didn't remain in France. Can you say a bit more about what transpired after that?
Yes, actually, when we came, we didn't stay in Paris. We went to what was then a village called Montmorency, which was perhaps an hour from Paris, and we lived there in a boarding house, all of us sharing one room with just a small sink in the room and the toilet out in the hallway to be shared with other people. My father was busy trying to find ways to get to Palestine because he had actually made application for a visa for the family to go to Palestine in 1935, around the time the Nuremberg laws were passed. And we were on a waiting list and had actually reached the top of the waiting list. But as we were packing sometime in 1937, my father was informed that another Jewish man also on the list was, they had learned, about to be arrested. And so he got our visa, and we kept hearing, as this became a pattern and we didn't get the visa, nothing will happen to you. I think what I want to say is my father understood that things, as he said, Germany was not a place for us anymore, and he had wanted to get out before everything happened. In Montmorency, where we were living, when World War II broke out, French policemen appeared at the boarding house and told my father that he was under arrest. He protested that he had been in Buchenwald, that he was Jewish, and they said, "You're a German national, you're the enemy, you have to come with us." And so he was again interned, and my mother now has 3 little girls, penniless. And it turned out that in the village of Montmorency, there was a well-known Jewish welfare organization, OSE, which had created homes for Jewish children who were separated or for other reasons in difficulty because of what the Nazis had done and the war. And my mother secured admission for my sisters and me in one of these homes. So this was now the final total separation from my mother. She managed to get a job as a cook in the home after we'd been there for several months, which she gladly accepted, although it was nothing like a comfortable middle-class Jewish woman would be expected to do. But although she was there, we were not really allowed to be with her in any way. And so the war went on, and finally, as the prize for the Nazis at that time was Paris, Montmorency was on the way to Paris, and so the village and the surrounding area started to be bombed, and there were a number of days, nights where the sirens went, and we went into the basement. And one of the quite clear memories I have of that time is the noise, the sound of the bombs, and the terror of the bombs. It's something that just stayed with me. About a day or so before the Nazis entered Paris, the homes were evacuated. The OSE had foreseen what would happen and had created homes in central France. And so once more, we were on the move. I always think of this as the Nazis coming in one end of Paris just as we got out of the other end. And we ended up in central France in a village not so far from Limoges. And I guess the difference between living in Montmorency and living in the home outside of Limoges was that we were under occupation. We were under Vichy France. The very specific things that affected us is in the winter it was very cold and there was no heat. We actually lived in a place called Chateau Montantin, and I remember telling my sister how jealous I was because she had a room in one of the turrets upstairs, and she said, "You don't know how lucky you are to be down in the dormitory because it's freezing." But the more serious problem was food. It was not starvation in what people underwent in the concentration camps. It was nothing like that. But we were always hungry, as my mother was desperately trying to stretch food in some way. It was, I think, the hunger more than anything else. But miraculously, I didn't spend the rest of the war in France. What actually happened is that the OSE received a small number of American visas for the United States. And children who were chosen to go would be the ones who were orphans, where wasn't known what had happened to the parents. And so some of them went, a small number, and everybody was excited for them. And a day and a half before they were ready to leave, two of the children became ill. You don't waste visas, they're too precious. And the only people who could take the place of those two children were my sister Ruth and I. And this was because my mother was there, and my father, when made his way to the home, the French had opened the doors to their internment camps, and the Jews made their way wherever they could. So both my parents were there to sign the papers. Actually, because Leah was a sibling, even though there were two visas, she also could have gone. And my mother didn't want us to go. She didn't want any of us to go. It's too far. My father said, that's the good point of it. They'll be safe there. And the compromise was that Ruth and I would go to America, whereas Leah, who was then 1941, she was not quite 5, and she stayed behind. And so we said goodbye. The journey, just very briefly, from the time we left at the end of June until we reached Lisbon, took about 6 weeks, 5 or 6 weeks, all kinds of complications. In Lisbon, for the first time, we stayed in a boarding school that was empty for the summer. And we came and we were told to go to the dining room, and we sat down to food, that masses of beautiful food that none of us had seen but had memory of meats, gravies, everything you could imagine, bread and butter, which somehow or other we all missed. And so what we did, we gorged ourselves. And what happened, which well documented, that if your body is not used to large amounts of food, rich foods, most of us got sick, but we were young and we were strong, we recovered. And in the middle of August, 1941, we sailed to America. And this is how I got away from the war and from the Nazis.
And you were reunited there eventually several years later with the rest of your family too.
Yes, I might just mention that we lived in various foster homes, which was also a traumatic experience. We were moved several times, and Ruth and I were not always together. The family was reunited sometime in 1946 when my parents and Leah came to America.
Well, it's a really extraordinary and dramatic story with lots of poignant moments. I was struck especially by the Pesach Seder in Leipzig in 1939, and I'm also struck by the fact that, you know, in the popular imagination, or even in the histories we write, you were one of the lucky ones, as we call them, right? Absolutely. In the sense that you got out of Germany, and yet it's so clear from the story that you tell, the challenges that you continue to face, the continued challenge of your story from leaving Germany, in France, you know, sailing by yourselves across to America, living with foster families. So I sit here looking at you, and you tell the story with such composure, and yet in my mind's eye, I'm imagining this 8-year-old, 9-year-old, 10-year-old, 11-year-old girl who's experiencing this, you know, by herself with her sister, what that must have meant. And I'm really struck by one thing when we spoke about this event and spoke about your story, and you talked about your mother's legacy, and your mother clearly being such an important aspect for you of this story. I wondered whether you wanted to relate her words or relate her legacy for the story before we finish.
My mother, she was unusual in that she didn't hide what happened. From the beginning, she said, everyone has to know what happened. It's important that everybody has to know, otherwise it's just going to happen again and happen again. And one of the major reasons that I was very pleased to be invited to come tonight, and why I have actually been speaking publicly about this story for probably 10, 12, I don't even know how long, is because I agree with my mother. It is her legacy and her feeling of the importance of people knowing what happened so that it should not repeat itself. Unfortunately, it's not quite the case. We continue to have terrible experiences of Holocaust, of anti-Semitism in this country, other European countries, certainly America. It's getting worse in a way because of the internet, and we just have to keep working and keep fighting and keep educating. We have to really not ignore it, not stand by, not say, well, it's not us. I feel that if you see whether it's written slurs or whether it's words, or if you see something, people have to stand up and they have to speak out against it. We can't just say it's terrible, it's happening. We have to fight this. Everybody has to take part in fighting anti-Semitism, because, you know, the Holocaust, I've always felt is the worst act of anti-Semitism in Jewish history, in the history of the world, really. And it really has to stop. It has to stop somehow. I have hopes.
Well, optimism is great to have at this precarious historical moment. We're very grateful to have you here with us. We're very grateful that you've shared your story with us. And we have some time now for questions for Eve, or general questions about Kristallnacht. I will field those questions, so please feel free to put them in the chat for us. Anybody want to kick us off? Don't be shy.
It's a very common experience, Shirley, that I have when I speak sometimes. People are kind of stunned, and then somebody does have something they want to know about, and I ask me anything you like, really.
Could I ask? I mean, it's an amazing story, but how were you able to rebuild your life after the war in America? How did you come together with your parents afterwards, or your parents found you, and how were you able actually to rebuild or to build a new life?
You mentioned my parents, and again, this is something that people are always surprised to hear, that the reunion, which in everyone's imagine has to be beautiful and wonderful, and you hug and you're all together, it wasn't like that. Because I was actually separated from my family, basically from the time it was a good 7.5 years, and it's time where I had grown from a little girl to almost a teenager. Plus, I had made a significant effort not to speak German, and I had forgotten a good part of my German. So we had to learn to get to know each other again. We had to learn, both my parents learned English. They were both proficient in language. They learned French very quickly when they got to France and spoke with an Alsatian accent. But it just took some while to really readjust to this change. I don't know what you mean by rebuilding life, except to say that my parents had a Jewish home in Germany, and we again had a Jewish home. We had a kosher home, and we joined a synagogue and kept holidays and so forth. And I continued my education, and one of the problems we had is that we were just poor and penniless, so that both my parents found work. My mother was working in a factory, and my father was initially doing something with furs, because many of the Jews who he knew from Leipzig were in fur business. And both my sister Ruth and I worked summers. Actually, I started to work in the summer before my parents even came. And my sister Ruth did something that she never told my mother about, or me, or anyone. When she graduated high school, she said to my mother, enough, you've worked so hard, you're going to stay home now, because I'm going to go to work, and I'll start studying at night, and I will work during the day. And I actually did the same thing. So basically, how did we lived, and we went to school, and we managed. But in the rebuilding, I have to say, it's a long answer, I think. I never told anybody about my history. I carried and found a sense of guilt, more so than many Jews, because I knew I replaced somebody who should have come to America, but got sick, which was a great difficulty. I, as I said, hid who I was. I always felt different, but I was very fortunate. I had my parents, I had an education, and you live and you get by with. I have to say, my parents were amazing. Their survival was amazing. It didn't just happen. They did. It's a long story, but they, during the war, took certain steps that helped them to save. I have to mention that they were in concentration camps in France for a considerable time, because there were French. There were concentration camps in France, and the conditions were no better than the Polish camps. So it was difficult for everybody.
Add a sentence to amplify. Eve, may I add a sentence? May I add a sentence to amplify what you said?
Go ahead.
I think that one reason that Eve and my mother and Leah, besides my family, were able to go on and lead or rebuild lives, as the questioner mentioned, is that they came here young enough to lose their accents and were able to be completely assimilated into American life and go to school and work without people constantly asking them where they were from. And my grandparents, who went to New York in late middle age, no matter how hard they tried, always had very distinct accents, which bothered them no end, because they could be in a public place like the theater at intermission, and someone would come up to them and interrupt them and ask them where they were from. And they wanted to be thought of as nothing but American. And they were so deeply, they wanted to get rid of any trace of Germanness. They were Jews and they were Americans, you know, even though it was important to talk about what had happened in the past.
Thanks,
you know, everyone deals with it differently. My own mother did not tell me about her childhood experiences, most of which I learned about in my late teens when I was reading Eve's first manuscript.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to have you here and to have you add to the story. So Eve, I'm going to relay to you some comments and questions that have come through the chat. There is a great deal of appreciation for you, people thanking you and feeling really honored to have you with us and to hear your story. There is a comment from Anna Grantham, which I just want to briefly convey, where she says, this isn't a question, but my daughter, Georgia, had the privilege of being with you, Eve, when she did March of the Living a few years ago, and Eve was in your coach. She wants to send you her love and say how much she admired you and tell you that she is now married and lives in Dallas.
Oh, thank you.
So now let me relay a series of questions. Some of them I think you've already covered in the answer that you've given, but I'm going to relay them anyway. One person asking a very interesting question: were you put with Jewish foster families in the United States? Then questions, I'll maybe relay all of them to you. Is that okay?
No, let me answer this
one at a time. Great.
I was in Jewish foster three homes. They were the people were all Jewish, but the one that I was in the longest observed nothing. They were not kosher. There were no holidays. So I really, in important years of growing up, I really didn't have any kind of Jewish life.
Thank you. So the next question, what happened to the children who are not lucky enough to get visas? And presumably this was in France now.
I only know that my mother told me that when when they got to be about 15 and a half, the French resistance, which worked together with the Osé homes, tried very hard to hide those children, because as soon as they reached 16, they were going to be arrested. I don't know from the homes I was in what specifically happened to the children. I have to assume that some of them perished. It's not possible that they all would have survived. I do know that the home that I was in, the organization actually gave up, and people were moved to another one, which was further out in the countryside, further away from the city, in the hope that just by being more out of sight, it would save them. But I have no details.
Another question is someone asking, what happened to your grandparents?
Grandfather, my father's father, who was deported to Poland, found either a half-sister or a stepsister whom he had not seen for a long time. I have no proof, but there is anecdotal evidence that he was walking in the street one day. He was by then 80 years old, and that he was beaten while he was in the street. And my father received notice of the fact that he had passed the day that the doors to the internment camps were opened in Paris. My maternal grandfather eventually left Germany, did what many Germans, he went to Holland. And how he got there was most of the time he walked. People didn't have cars, didn't have, they just walked. He literally pretty much walked from Leipzig to Halle, survived in the Netherlands for 2 years. He was then arrested, taken to the infamous transit camp of Westerbork until he was put on a train to Auschwitz, and he was murdered on the day that he got there. My mother also had a younger sister who was arrested in France. And from the day that she was arrested until she was murdered in Auschwitz was a matter of something like 12 days.
Eve, Brian Plen is asking for the name of your memoirs, and I just wanted to note to everybody that I've just put in the chat the URL where you can see both the book itself, which Eve has now
Yes.
put on there free online. I don't know if you want to say something about it.
When I asked my mother to tell me what happened, I actually set up a tape recorder and based on what she told me and further questions subsequently, the book that I wrote is called Shattered Crystals. It is available free on the internet. No adverts, no, it is, among other things, we go back to, my mother said, everyone has to know what happened. And I have no interest in making any money out of this. I just want as many people to read as possible. If you Google Shattered Crystals, it will come up with my name, and there is a link on the page where you can read the book. It's about 300 pages. And do go to it, because there is a lot more that I wasn't able to cover tonight.
Thank you, Eve. I think that is probably a good note on which to wrap up. There were a few more questions, some of them quite long and complex historical questions, which were sent to me. So I apologize for not answering them, but given that we have a minute or two left, it felt right to end on Eve's story. So I will wrap it up here before passing over to Cassie by just saying thank you so much again to Eve for taking the time to share your story with us, parts of which was so painful and traumatic. And it takes a real kind of bravery both to relay that story at the best of times and at a time where we know you're mourning your sister Leah, who we remember again now. So thank you so much on behalf of everyone again for being here with us. And I'll hand over now to Cassie from March of the Living.
Wow, thank you, Shirley and Eve, for a truly inspirational presentation and conversation. I've heard Eve speak many a time, but even now hearing your testimony gives me shivers. It's always great when communal organisations come together to deliver education. So a huge thank you this evening to our partners at the London School of Jewish Studies and the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre. As Shirley said, I'm Cassie and I'm the CEO at March of the Living UK. We're an educational Holocaust charity who runs programmes to Poland each year, culminating in the famous March of the Living event, where every year 12,000 people from all over the world walk out of the gates of Auschwitz together alongside Holocaust survivors. And I can see in the chat a few people saying that they had been on the programme, both with Eve, and also I can see Marla and Harry also on the call. For the 82nd anniversary of Kristallnacht, today we launched a global interfaith campaign to unite in solidarity against attacks on synagogues and houses of worship around the world. We felt this very fitting to do on the Kristallnacht anniversary. We were overwhelmed with thousands of people from all around the world, from various different religions, sharing message, shining light over the darkness of hate. And this evening we had a very special presentation where we projected those messages, including a message from Eve on the walls of Jerusalem, and also the cathedral in Coventry, which was the cathedral that was bombed in World War II. This campaign has been endorsed both by the Prime Minister of England and of Israel. I'll leave a message in the chat where you can see some of these messages, but I just want to finish by sharing with you a short clip that was actually on television this evening, showcasing the powerful campaign. If you want to see the full campaign and all the messages projected on the walls of Jerusalem or Coventry Cathedral, you can go onto our Facebook page, which is March of the Living UK. But I'm just going to finish by sharing this very short clip.
A special event's been taking place at Coventry Cathedral this evening to remember Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. On this evening, 82 years ago, the Nazis started a two-day attack on Jewish businesses, synagogues and institutions across Germany and Austria. It's regarded as a devastating prelude to the so-called final solution, which led to the death of about 6 million Jews across Europe. Well, Kevin Reid is at the cathedral this evening. What's been happening, Kevin?
Well, Nick, as you can see behind me, messages of hope and goodwill from around the globe are being projected onto religious buildings and institutions, including here at Coventry Cathedral. It's all part of under the theme of Let There Be Light, and it's been organised by March of the Living UK, which is a Holocaust memorial group. And I'm joined now by the founder of that group, Scott Saunders. Scott, why have you chosen Coventry?
Of course, Coventry is very symbolic in terms of Second World War memorials. The cathedral, the city, on the 14th of November 1940, was severely damaged and much of it destroyed by the Luftwaffe. So I think it's very fitting.
And what other cities are taking part?
Various cities around the world, primarily in Jerusalem and Frankfurt and here. Those are the three main cities that have been chosen, but participants from everywhere.
And how important is it that we remember the night of the broken glass?
When we look at the history of Nazism and what happened on that particular night, I think it's very important that we refuse to allow hatred to go unchecked. When they pick on synagogues, churches and mosques, we have to stand up and fight that.
Well, it really was a truly terrifying time all those years ago, Nick, and people are being discouraged from coming here because of the coronavirus restrictions. So if you want to see more about it and actually watch some of it, you can go to the March of the Living UK Facebook page.
Kevin, thank you.
So I want to thank you all this evening. If you still want to get involved in our Kristallnacht campaign, you can do in the chat. A thank you again to Shirley and to Eve. And I think we're going to leave this open in case anyone wants to say hello. But the event's now officially closed. So I want to wish you all a good evening.